aspects, but more qualitative aspects of whether it is, in fact, easy or not to access finance. So in that sense, focusing on the most vulnerable countries and communities in general, we can see, for example, that for LDCs and seeds, they face a lot of institutional capacity barriers, but they still are quite prone to climate change-induced disasters. They're 7 out of 10 of the 10 most vulnerable countries. The share of climate finance that flows towards these very vulnerable countries in general has either not evolved or actually recently decreased. There's also problems with the heterogeneous access by most vulnerable countries to big flows of finance, so from multilateral and bilateral sources. They fall short of the needs of the most vulnerable. They also often come in the form of rather inappropriate instruments like loans that exacerbate issues like debt and debt sustainability in many countries. And they're basically just mostly insufficient to meet the actual needs of vulnerable communities and countries around the world. There's also more qualitative aspects of it in terms of like the big flows. When we focus, for example, on bilateral finance, we see that bilateral finance tends to be rather discretionary. So basically, developed countries decide where the finance goes without any consideration for the actual needs of developing countries. They're prone to interest and policy goals of the donors. And there's very scarce devolution of decision-making on where these finance is actually used. It's also focused and concentrated on selected countries, and therefore it's seen like the fair access to these finance is actually a challenge. There's also, from the more multilateral side, issues of eligibility criteria in terms of what kind of finance can be accessed. So obviously higher income countries, even though they are still vulnerable to climate change, but from the income perspective, they have maybe achieve a higher level of income, then they lose the possibility to access more concessional flows of finance. And so obviously these constitute barriers, especially in light of high debt burdens. And then finally, for the financial mechanisms of the UNFCCC, even though they have specific mandates to address the needs of the most vulnerable, they still face, and they address the shortcomings of the other flows like bilateral and other multilateral flows, but there's still some challenges. And in this sense, especially for adaptation, the big challenge is that developing countries, especially the vulnerable ones, are always requested to prove that they are vulnerable and to like demonstrate this strong rationale that adaptation is actually, that what they're trying to achieve is actually adaptation, which often requires a lot of long-term hydrometeorological data, which is hard to come by in developing countries, especially the most vulnerable of them. And finally, many funds like the GCF, for example, from the financial mechanism require, even though technically not formally, but like implicitly, amounts of mobilized co-financing that can be hard to come by also by, for the most vulnerable, especially smaller countries where co-financing is harder to come by. And with that, I think the conclusion is that developing countries still face many challenges, and adaptation, as has been mentioned, clearly faces the most challenges. It is the reason why the share of adaptation finance is still quite low compared to mitigation finance. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertha, very much for your comprehensive presentations. And for my own perspective, so I am currently representing like many CSO in my country, in a developing country, Vietnam. And one of the things that SRD and CWG is currently working on is developing agroforestry and native tree planting to reduce soil erosion and drought. And also we are promoting use of crops byproducts for feeding animals. That helps the community to adapt with climate change. But NGO in Vietnam, in my country, we are facing many challenges, access to climate finance. And one of the key challenges that we are facing, that also Bertha just mentioned, that is we are being marginalized in the climate finance process and mechanisms. And there are mechanisms, there are policy, but we don't have the access into the policy making process. And also, from my own perspective, from my own context, there is a lack of awareness and capacity of local governments to access the climate finance. So it's not only the CSO, but also the government in developing countries. They don't have the capacity, they don't have the access to those informations and knowledge that enable them to access to climate finance, especially for adaptations. And also, that we can all see that the UNFCCC financial mechanism is very limited, especially for those working at the communities, the small NGOs, small community initiatives, but the big ones. And also the very last one, and we would like to address in here is the challenges that we see from the 2 days of the World Leaders Summit, and also we've been talking a lot that climate change is affecting everyone, and especially the most vulnerable groups in developing countries. And there's an increasing need of climate finance for adaptations, and we're not seeing it. And today is the 3rd of November, the Finance Days at COP26, and we would like to suggest some of our recommendations from CSO perspective that could help to foster climate finance for adaptations, especially in the developing context. The first one we would like to address in here is we need to increase climate finance to meet the adaptation finance gap that we urge international community to increase international climate finance, especially focusing on resilient, focusing to support the most affected communities, and also scale up public spending on adaptation by governments to support local-led adaptations. We need more support, and we are relying on the government to support us, so we can have more resources, we can have more finance to support the community in need. And also, we suggest that we could have better monitoring system that monitor international and national adaptation efforts and financial flow, especially highlighting the CSO role in as an independent observer, which can hold financial implementation process accountable and transparent. And also, we are addressing that we need to refine the MRV framework under the UNFCCC, and it should be standardized and transparent. And also, we are suggesting that we should introduce adaptation-related levy on transaction under the new carbon market mechanism that we are going to discuss in the next few days. And we suggest that 5% cut of the carbon market should go into climate finance to support the adaptations. And the very last point that we would like to recommend is we should aim for ambitious new common global climate finance goal after 2025. And this should focus on unavoidable loss and damage, because we are witnessing it like everywhere in the world, especially in those vulnerable nations to climate change. And in addition, the new climate finance goal should emphasize the providing climate finance to local level and strengthen the positions of CSO to deliver as a main partner of governments of UNFCCC to meet the global adaptation goals. So those are our key recommendations from CSO in Vietnam, and I believe it's also speak for many others in developing countries. And also, we have been talking a lot about our activities at the community level, and we cannot talk about it without addressing the most vulnerable groups like women, youth, and also talking about very important aspect of adaptation is health. So now I'd like to turn the spotlight into our next guest speakers, Marlene Achoki from CARE International. So my question for you is from your own perspective and your own experience working in Africa, working in the front line with communities. Why do you think it is important for climate finance to prioritize gender transformative actions? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tuan. We know that climate change is making gender inequality worse, and this is because women and men and boys and girls are affected differently by the impacts of climate change. And this means that when we are doing budgeting in terms of climate finance, then we need to take into considerations the needs of these two different groups, because then if we do not do this, then the inequality gap continues to increase. So most women, poor women and girls in the villages have actually powerful role to play in agents in addressing climate change, but most of the time we are not having them on board, and we are not tapping into the knowledge and experience that they have to actually help in propelling the strategies and needs that actually would be able to bring a positive impact at the community level in terms of working with the women and girls. So climate change finance plays a critical role in supporting developing countries to address the impacts of climate change. And this is basically because developing countries don't have the opportunity anymore to develop on dirty coal, I would say, but basically would look forward to develop on clean energy and sustainable energy that also looks into the just transition of how the communities will be able to have a resilient life, and also build the capacities of women and girls in different contexts. So there are many ways that, but of course, we do not want climate finance to be repackaged as well from ODA to climate finance. It should be additional. This is because then if we transfer money from the ODA to overseas development assistance to climate finance, this means that other aspects of gender, education, and hunger are not being taken care of, and also this means that the budget will be squeezed further and this will not be able to assist the people in developing countries who are actually facing the brunt of climate change and who need the resources more. So there are a number of ways for scaling climate finance, and the first one is basically to increase climate finance adaptation to 50-50, and this is because for developing countries, of course, most of the target that we're looking at up to is building resilience and capacity of the communities and the different groups that are facing the impacts of climate change, and this means by having this finance in adaptation increased, and this is linked to the national adaptation plans that countries develop, and most of the time we have the gender aspect and ensure that these groups are actually incorporated in the national adaptation plans priorities, and once we have funding that goes to adaptation, then it covers the needs of both girls and boys and women as well. So it's very important as well to undertake gender-responsive budgeting and responsive measures when we are budgeting for climate finance. So it's very key that when in a certain percentage of climate finance is channeled to gender-responsive actions, to specifically locally led adaptation actions to women groups, and also I would say basically observations and also different marginalized groups. And this is important because then these finances will be targeting directly the needs and the capacity, the needs and also the priorities of the women and girls in different communities. So another important thing is the commitment to ensure that climate finance, of course, is new and additional, and this is focusing on loss and damage. Because we know that the impacts of loss and damage are not reversible, and we can neither adapt and mitigate to that, but it's basically to support the women and girls who already in front or in the front line of the crisis of climate change in terms of loss and damage. And this will be very important for them to get the resources when they need it, because if we have floods and everything has been swept away, so how does the women and the children and the girls get back to their feet actually almost immediately? Because if we take time to actually respond to this crisis at that time when it occurs, then it does not meet the needs at that point of the different targeted groups. And also, just to conclude, is that we need to ensure that, of course, the donor countries step up financial support to gender just action by ensuring that it supports gender equality in all the programs, and also to ensure that the funds that are being channeled on climate finance, there is a clear and clear gap in terms of gender responsive action and priority in financing these climate change projects. And finally, there is very important need to ensure that the budgeting processes and also having women on the table in terms of participating in decision making and participating at the conference of parties meetings and decision makings, and also other locally led actions. This is to ensure that their needs are also taken into consideration and they're able to own the projects and also be in part and parcel of activities that are being conducted at the developing countries and also at the local level, to be specific. Thank you.
Thank you, Malina, very much. And so we heard a bit about gender just and the gender aspect in climate finance for adaptations. But now I'd like to turn the spotlight into health, a very important aspect of our life. And then we cannot do anything without health. So now I would like to invite Professor Susanna Mahi. So I know you have been working in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and you are also a very active trustee of the Margaret Pyke Trust. So from your perspective and your experience working but both NGO and academic background, what do you think are some of the key priorities to policy changes which are needed in the context of climate crisis and health system? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tuan. So I think we're all aware that the climate crisis is truly global, but many of those who are most affected are women and girls in the countries who often have the least resources to respond and to adapt to those crises. And earlier this year, UNFPA produced a report detailing how the climate crisis harms women. It increases their vulnerability, which leads to increased gender-based violence, poor neonatal maternal health outcomes, and critically, it restricts their access to reproductive health services, particularly family planning, which could reduce high-risk and unwanted pregnancies and could lessen the poor neonatal and maternal outcomes. Currently, there are 140 million women who have no access to contraception but who want to use it, and therefore they have no choice over their futures. And for the women and girls who are facing increased vulnerability from climate crises, they should be a policy priority. Yet, at the very time when we should be increasing funding for reproductive health and for adapting health systems to effectively deliver reproductive health services, the UK government has actually slashed funding to reproductive health, and other countries have also reduced funding as they've concentrated on the COVID pandemic response in their own countries. So in the next 2 weeks here at COP, by the end of next week, we must make COP26 count for women and girls. And there are 2 ways that I think it can do this. First, COP can provide opportunities and commitments to support new kinds of partnerships between environment and health groups that can expand access to services, particularly to those living in remote and particularly climate-affected places. And with my London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine hat, I am leading a research component of a project in Uganda that's led by the Margaret Pyke Trust. And we're trying to do exactly that. We've created an innovative new partnership between the International Crane Foundation, the Margaret Pyke Trust, and a local hospital, Rugarama. And we are trying to provide sexual and reproductive health services, family planning services, alongside biodiversity and environment and livelihoods actions, so that we can provide a holistic response that addresses both the reproductive health needs that people tell us that they have and the livelihoods issues arising from environmental change that they're facing. So, new partnerships. The second thing that COP can achieve and must achieve, as we've heard, today is dubbed the Finance Day here. Well, a key policy priority that needs to come out from COP today is an opening up of climate adaptation funding to encompass family planning and reproductive health services and health system strengthening to deliver those services. And there is precedent. The IPCC's fifth assessment report recognized the importance of family planning and its co-benefits. The IUCN last year passed a resolution to recognize, and I quote, the importance to the conservation of nature of removing barriers to rights-based voluntary family planning. And that was a resolution put forward by the Margaret Pyke Trust, who's the only IUCN member with a reproductive health background. And there's funding precedents too. The UK's flagship biodiversity funding mechanism, the Darwin Initiative, which was actually established after the Rio Earth Summit. Last year, it funded its first program that included reproductive health, and that's the Uganda project that I mentioned. So at COP26, we're expecting countries to commit to the $100 billion a year pledge to tackle the climate crisis. Now, a mere 0.5% of that would provide family planning services to the 140 million women who currently don't have access to it. That's a human right, but it's also a critical adaptation strategy for women at most risk of negative climate impacts. And 0.5% seems a very small price tag for giving women and girls a future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the COVID-19 had taught us one thing, that we cannot abandon the health system. And we already witnessed it. And we just talked about the health system focusing on reproductive health. But now I'd like to invite our colleague, Steve, from FHI 360. I know you've been working tirelessly to support government in different countries, especially the government in Vietnam, focusing on health. So maybe you can share with us some of your perspective. I know you have speakers from Vietnam today, so the floor is yours. Steve?
Thank you very much. So just to say that FHI 360 is a global not-for-profit which has been partnering with governments and civil society organizations to support the delivery of health services for 50 years. Working alongside our partners, we've witnessed how the health crisis and health and economic crisis caused by COVID-19 is exacerbating existing vulnerabilities and driving up the cost of climate action. Our projects target both climate change mitigation, like renewable energy for health clinics, and technology to strengthen food security and nutrition systems. And we can see that the health sector has a significant role to play in both mitigating climate change and also in building resilience, a climate-smart health approach, if you like. There are obviously some very big challenges and some very big tasks, but there are some easy asks that can be done immediately. Improving the availability of and access to information on opportunities for climate finance, which is a real problem for many country-level health sector professionals. Connecting health actors with climate financing processes, and enhancing the capacity to prepare climate change proposals. However, as we have heard from my fellow panelists, good development initiatives like climate-smart approaches need to be locally led by those living on the front line of the climate crisis, and they need to be heard in their own voice. FHI 360 has been a trusted partner of the government of Vietnam, supporting health and health system strengthening programs for over 20 years. Although she can't be here, I am extremely pleased to be able to introduce a presentation by Dr. Lian Huong, Vietnam's Director General of the Health Environment Management Agency. Thank you.
On all fronts, healthcare systems are on the front lines of climate change. The health sector has an important role to play in both mitigating climate change through the adaptation of low carbon strategies and building resilience to climate impact. Worldwide, governments have been slow to embrace climate-smart health agendas due to the lack of funding support. It is disturbing to see that less than 1% of international climate finance has been allocated to support health projects. The health sector has been largely excluded from these financings, with health and health systems disconnected from the major instruments of global climate action. This global trend truly reflects the reality in our country. According to the Global Climate Risk Index, Vietnam ranked 13th among the economies most affected by climate change between 2000 and 2019. The health and economic crisis caused by COVID-19 is worsening existing vulnerabilities and driving up the cost of climate action. In 2018, Vietnam approved the National Action Plan for Responding to Climate Change of Health Sector, period 2019 to 2030 and Vision to 2050. However, the implementation of this plan has some challenges due to limited allocation of budget. The Ministry of Health has taken strong effort to integrate the plan activities to regular health tasks and relevant existing programs, and mobilize technical and financial support from stakeholders. For example, the Ministry of Health is piloting climate resilient water, sanitation, and hygiene in healthcare facility models in collaboration with WHO. The Ministry of Health also is one of implementing agencies to implement the GCF-funded project, Vietnam National Adaptation Plan Development and Operationalization Support, which is chaired by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. However, many areas in the National Action Plan of the health sector need to be mainstreamed into the above-mentioned National Adaptation Plan with the sufficient allocation of the funding resource. Here at COP26, I am calling on nations, multilateral and bilateral agencies, NGOs, and private sector to discuss the long-term climate regime during the 2020 to 2025 transition, taking into account the needs and priorities of health sector and facilitating access to climate finance for climate-smart healthcare. Secondly, it is important to go beyond the formal health sector and address the determinants of health, such as clean and reliable energy, water and sanitation services, and food security. Ministry of Health in Vietnam and Ministry of Planning and Investment, together with other line ministries, international partners, including UNDP and WHO, and NGOs such as FHI 360, are planning to test new methods for assessing climate finance for climate-smart healthcare, build and contribute to the global evidence base of what works. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lin Huong. And some of the keywords that we have been seeing repeatedly are like more finance, especially finance for adaptations. We need more transparency. We need more gender-just actions. We need more budget for reproductive health. And also we need more finance for health system resilient. So now we have a bit of time for the Q&A sections, and I know that we are here in Glasgow, but we are joining by many others on the COP26 platform. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and give us the questions. And also we have an amazing panelist in here, and I am sure that we can discuss a bit more on the pot of gold Where is it? So maybe we wait for a few more seconds for people to have a think and then send us the questions. So during that time, I have a personal question I'd like to ask, and I would like to send it to Professor Mayhew, that you mentioned a project that you implemented in Uganda. Could you share some of the key findings from your research about the community perceptions on the connection between climate and health, and the need for the new approaches from your research?
Thank you very much. Yes, so the Healthy Wetlands for the Cranes and People of Ruchiga, Uganda, that's the name of the project. So that's funded by the Darwin Initiative. It's led by the Margaret Pyke Trust, and I'm leading a research component alongside that to inform the package of services that's provided. And at the moment, we've been collecting baseline data, and that has helped to illustrate how people see the connections between health and environment, and what they see, the sorts of responses that they want from us. So we've gathered data which shows, I think, three sort of key things. Firstly, that people are clear, most of these community members are farmers, and they are experiencing changing rainfall patterns and weather events, which lead to crop failures and destruction, and also severe flooding, which again washes away crops and soils. And that undermines livelihoods, of course, and leads to poor mental health, particularly for men. And one of the consequences of that is that there's an increase in alcoholism, and there's a lot of locally brewed strong spirits. And the consequence of that for women is that there's been an increase in domestic violence, gender-based violence. And at the same time, women are put at greater risk of unwanted or high-risk pregnancies if they're exposed to violence, but they have almost no access to contraceptive services. And the respondents from the 8 villages that we've been visiting were very clear that they wanted better family planning services and better general health services, as well as support to develop more sustainable ways of farming and sustainable livelihood methods. And they were clear that if they had those things in a more holistic package of support and response, that they would be able to properly feed their families, they would send their children to school, and they would secure the futures for their children. So people's lives are not lived in silos. The communities we spoke to, as I said, very clearly saw the connections between health and environment and reproductive health. And how that connected with the sorts of sustainable futures that they wanted. And that's why we need to fund and support and evaluate these sorts of innovative cross-sector new partnership type approaches. And climate financing plays a critical role in enabling those sorts of partnerships in order to build resilient local responses for both human and environmental health. So that sort of joined up response, I think, is the sort of innovation that we were trying to showcase.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayhew. And we got a question here. So we have like a lot of questions from people sending to us. I know like climate finance, especially climate finance, is a so-called very hot topic, but may have a question for all the panelists in here. I received a question here that we mentioned a lot about decision making. How can we engage more in the decision making process? So may I just pose that question to all the panelists in here? How can we get on the table for decision making? I heard that a lot from the presentations. So maybe could you give us some of your perspective relating to decision-making process? So maybe we can start with Malene.
Thank you, Tuan. So there are a number of ways that we can actually get into the table in terms of climate finance. And this one will start from at the national level, basically in our countries, and being in part and parcel in developing the policies that are in climate finance friendly, and also promoting gender and women needs at the same time. So in terms of participating in the national, I know countries are doing the national adaptation plans, the national determined contributions, the national climate change action plans. So this is, for me, this is the baseline point whereby we will start participating and being on the table at our country level, and also connecting now also, of course, with our communities in the different projects that we are working with them, and then linking to the global level right now. That's why we're here basically now to discuss how do we move forward in terms of climate finance, how do we bridge the gap in terms of ensuring that we have the 50-50 adaptation, mitigation, climate finance, and also how do we ensure that we do not increase the gap of gender inequality, and ensuring that women are sitting at the table, and also we are promoting a budget responsive budgeting, gender responsive budgeting, to ensure that all the needs of the different groups are taken into consideration when we are making the plans and also making the decisions, to ensure that it is meeting the needs and also priority of the people who really in the forefront or the front line of the impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marlene. Thank you. And so may I invite Bertha, can you share some of your perspective in terms of decision-making process? How can we engage more, especially for climate finance adaptations? Bertha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I think the important point I would like to make is the decision-making of what finance gets used to, or like what finance gets used for, where the priorities lie for climate finance, needs to be devolved to the developing countries at the most appropriate level, whether it is the national government, the local community, private sector, civil society, but it needs to, the decision-making power should be at that level. So they need to decide what the priorities are, and how to use these finance. And for that, obviously, it requires quite a revision of the models of finance provision that we used, shifting away from what I was mentioning, the discretionary nature of certain channels, like bilateral channels, which usually get, used through developed countries' own organizations and own institutions of development and climate. And they need to shift from that focus to a focus more on the local level. And I think, obviously, it's quite an ask. It's not an easy thing to achieve, I would say, but until we give the power of deciding what the priorities are to the most appropriate level in developing countries, then we will keep seeing, we will keep missing the priorities, and we'll keep missing the important things, especially for adaptation, I would say.
Thank you very much, Bertha. And from my perspective, from CSO perspective, we see that we are lacking the representative and participation of CSO, who are the people working at the community level, the grassroots level, helping the communities. So again, one of our recommendations for policy making is to bring the role of CSO into the policy making process, decision making process. And then it can start by just simply making CSO as an independent observer, which can hold like financials process more transparent. We can support the monitoring and evaluation process, and then we have the capacity, but we just need to be there. We just need to be included, so we can support, and then to make everything goes smoother. And then I think that is one of the key goals for COP26 this year, collaboration for climate change. Let me check if we have more questions. I know we have so many questions from participants in here, but the time is limited, the clock is ticking, so I have to be very selective. I apologize for that. Okay, so I just got the news that we have the representative from UK government watching us. Okay, so I have another question for Marlene. So the question is, could you give an example of the types of gender transformative projects that climate finance should fund? I think you've been working on gender transformative projects like for, I don't know, very long. So could you give us some of the example that you have in mind, Marlene?
So thank you, Tuan, for that interesting question. So in terms of gender budgeting, responsive budgeting, we're talking about when we are having a project that we want it funded, then we have to ensure that we are very intentional to ensure that we are checking out what are the needs basically for different groups in a certain context where we are working. And so this means that we have to ensure that we're doing like different groups assessment needs and to ensure to see what are the different needs for different contexts of different areas, because of course the needs are differ depending on the countries and also the context, and what are the priorities as well. So once we have this key information at hand, then when we are doing the budgeting, then we ensure that we know that for this group, this is what is more important, this is what is needed, and this is how we can actually be able to achieve this by doing this kind of projects. And so when we have this, and also sex disaggregated data is also very important information while doing gender budgeting, and then we can be able to see what is the overall age of the population that we are working in, and then ensure that then we are able to, it's targeted to different groups and different needs. And this then means that when we are doing our project, then it is targeted and it is real, and then this means that it will be able to meet the needs of the people who are really at the front line in terms of climate change and who need the support most. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marlene. And so I have another questions in here. I promise that I will try to get all the questions, but bear with me, the time is limited. So capacity is another issue that we are talking a lot. Without capacity, we cannot do anything. So we have a question in here. What kind of capacity do we need to access or enable climate finance to support gender, health, and system resilience? So may I bring this question into Dr. Susanna. Can you share with us some of the capacity that you feel that we need more to access or enable climate finance? The floor is yours.
Well, I'll speak from a research perspective. I think others probably have other things to say on the sort of capacities of engaging with the different finance mechanisms, which I don't know so much about. Obviously, as a researcher, I would say that we need to better understand how communities can be supported by health systems on the front line and how these different sectors work together. So building a good understanding of how a health sector takes into account meteorological forecasting for early warning and preparedness, for example, or works with the agriculture sector around which crops are most nutritious and can grow in this changing climate. So I think there are a lot of health systems questions that we still need answers to, and we need more case study evidence of how best to work with and support communities. And my colleagues have spoken very much about decision-making needing to be at the front line. One of the things that I was talking on earlier today was the need for community voices to be part of decision-making around developing adaptive health systems that are resilient and moving forward, because it's the local people who have the best knowledge, both of the climate impacts that they're facing and of how best, what solutions are most likely to work. So I think we need to build the capacity of the health systems to better listen to and work with local communities and frontline health staff, actually, who are affected by climate, and hear women's voices and hear the voices of communities in working out how we can respond in cross-sector ways. But obviously, climate financing must support that. But I think I would need to defer to others who know more about the mechanisms themselves. But research needs to be a key part of it.
Thank you very much. And Yes, I was about to ask you.
We can keep the discussion. We can keep the discussion. I mean, I think capacity building is also about building networks, the capacity of networks to work together. I think there's many actors at play here: health sector actors, climate change actors, financing actors, and actually building their capacity to work together and learn from each other, I think, is critical. Health actors have the data that's going to build the evidence base to enable policymakers to make informed decisions. So I think that building the capacity of the networks to work effectively together to maximize their value is critical.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I just want to repeat the message from us again, from the CSO perspective, that we are working very closely with the government, like in my country, in Vietnam, but one of the challenge that both CSO and the government are facing is the capacity to access to climate finance at the global level. For example, the Green Climate Fund is very challenging for us to get a project, to get approval. So I think that some of the key recommendations from us is we need more capacity building for both governments and CSO and communities to enable them to access to climate finance, because that is what we need. And without capacities, the money is there, but there's no way for us to access to that. I know that it is very challenging and it takes time, but we have to start. And today is the third day of COP26, and I believe there's a reason why we put climate finance on the very first day of negotiations, because this is very important. And for people from developing countries, from vulnerable groups, we need that finance to adapt with climate change. Otherwise, the price is lives and livelihoods and health, and women and girls and many other vulnerable groups will have to pay the price. So I just like to conclude our side event today by repeating some of the message that we need to include climate finance. We need to increase climate finance, focusing on adaptations. Try to remember the 50-50%, not like the 20% or 30%, but 50-50. And also, we need more transparent climate finance mechanisms that allow everyone to access in both government, CSO, and communities. And also, we need to build capacity of governments, of CSO communities to access to that pot of money, because the pot of money is there, but we don't know how to access it. And also another number that we need to remember is $100 billion. We are still in shortage of that gap, and there'll be no way we can achieve our climate goal without the finance. And then few other things in here that we need to consider: women, girls, boys, and other groups in the decision-making process. Make sure that the climate finance mechanism address their needs and leave no one behind. And also thinking about the reproductive health. That is a very important part that we cannot forgive. And I'd like to conclude by linking up with the current pandemic is still very going on, and I don't know whether it's going to stop this year or next year. That reminds us that we need to build up our health system, to build our health system and make it more resilient to climate change, and there'll be more to come. So we need to be strong on that. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists very much for your time to come here today in Glasgow at COP26, and also many others joining us online on COP26 platform and on YouTube. To conclude the side event today, no pot of gold for community adaptations and system resilience, I would like to share with you a short video from us to deliver our message on climate finance for adaptations. Thank you very much, and hope we have a successful COP26. Hopefully we can have Glasgow agreement this year with like climate finance for adaptation. Thank you very much.